results over the past number of weeks. I'll point some of the polling trends and how they changed considerably between the opinion polls and the actual polls. So if we just look at some of the stats, in 2016, Fine Gael, which would be the EPP party, achieved 25.5% of the vote. Fianna Fáil 24.3%, and Sinn Féin 13.8%, the Green Party 2.7%, and then there's a number of smaller parties, but we'll just stick with those for the moment, and a number of independents. So you move to the 2020 election, and again the opinion polls over the past 6 to 8, 12 months and our internal polling indicated that general trend would continue, but that our party would edge ahead of Fine Gael, that some of the polls were showing us as high as 30%, 27%, but the general trend of polls was in the late 20s. So that was our expectation right into the beginning of the campaign. We could see that Fine Gael was slipping from its 25%, but we, again, analysing the trends and the polling, it looked as if they'd be 22, 23, and we'd be 27, 28. Sinn Féin was showing some change in the polls, but generally Sinn Féin always underperforms, or heretofore had always underperformed on the actual polling day. So people would suggest that they'd vote Sinn Féin, but when it came to it, they didn't. Now, I'm taking for granted that those of you that are here, have some understanding of all the party. Sinn Féin is a populist party with its origins in the conflict in Northern Ireland, and has, in the last sort of 15 years, started to emerge as a political force in the Republic. But just looking at those trends, that was what was expected. Fianna Fáil, expected to lead the next government. Not clear how we might do that, but certainly as being the biggest party. 2020 comes along, and Fine Gael dropped 5 points, kind of in line with expectations, but we didn't expect them maybe to drop quite that much. We dropped rather than gained. We dropped to 22%, and Sinn Féin went to 24.5%, an increase of 11. Very, very considerable increase in support there that manifested itself on the day. Green Party increased from 2% to 12%, so they had a 10% increase, albeit at a very small base. They had, I think it was 2 seats. They had 2 seats previously, and they now have 12. So just in seats then, because we probably need to talk a little bit about the Irish system, which I'll go back to in a minute, but just in seat numbers, in 2016 Fine Gael had 50 seats, they now have 35. We had 44, we now have 38. Sinn Féin had 23 and they now have 37. The Greens had 2 and they now have 12. So if you look at that configuration, it's pretty difficult from this vantage point to see how or what format the next government will be. If you look at the ideologies of the parties and their electoral strength, it's going to be very difficult to agree a programme for government that's coherent and sustainable for any duration. So that's going to be a difficulty for the parties to try to put together some kind of an arrangement. So I suspect it's going to take a lot of time, and it may result in another election. I had been asked previously, just for those of you that are not familiar with the voting system that we have in Ireland. So we have multi-seat constituencies, and we have the transferable vote. So in my constituency, for example, it's a 4-seater. We, based on our polling, felt that we could win 2 seats there. We tried really hard. At the 2016 election, we had tried to win 2 seats. We got by far the greatest number of votes, but we didn't have a good vote management strategy. So on this occasion, I, being the sitting member with the greatest vote, attempted to divide my vote a little bit so that we could get somebody else elected. And maybe we overcompensated and the other guy got elected and we didn't get the 2 seats. But so essentially transferable vote, for those of you that don't know, you get your ballot paper, there's a list of candidates. In my constituency there were 15, and you start with your first choice and you place a 1 beside that name. You then continue 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as you wish. And through a whole process of counting, Those votes get apportioned and reassigned as somebody either passes the magic number or gets eliminated, and the vote transfers. There's probably a breakfast in explaining that system. So, and it becomes very mathematical and very detailed, which those of us that are around the system of government in Ireland are well versed in. But it's a rather boring topic at this hour of the morning. But there's definitely a breakfast in it at some stage. But in this instance, there were 4 individuals elected from different parties in my constituency. It was our target, and we just about had the votes to do it if our vote management was just a little bit better. But it's very difficult to structure your strategy in advance to maximise your seat gain based on your first preference vote. That's it. That's an overview, and I'll take any questions rather than you listening to me ad nauseam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timmy. I will take the privilege as a moderator to start with the first questions. I might add that your constituency is Clark in Western Ireland. And what I found interesting when having a look at the result is that, for example, Sinn Féin only had 42 candidates, although you need, for a majority in Parliament, you need 80 candidates. So you might expect for a Parliament that has 160 seats, a majority required for 80 seats, that a party nominates at least 80 candidates. Is that a strategy, for example, or is this rather an accident?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I'll tell you why. If we were surprised by the surge in support for Sinn Féin, it pales into insignificance by the surprise that Sinn Féin had at the surge in their polls. There's probably, and you'll forgive me for not being as versed in all the details of all the constituencies, because being involved in my own area. But there's, off the top of my head, there's probably 4 or 5 constituencies where if Sinn Féin had ran a second candidate, they would have won 2 seats. There's one in Waterford where the sitting TD got 20,000 votes, and so he could have easily, the party leader's constituency, she could have had somebody elected with her, and they were a little bit shy about that because in one of the really strong areas in the northwest in Donegal, previously they had ran 2 candidates, and running 2 candidates can split the vote and you can end up losing. And they had done that previously, and it impacted on their ultimate success. So they were cautious going into this campaign. They didn't believe the polling numbers, and the actual votes outperformed all the polls up to that point. So it was a surprise to us, to Fine Gael. It was a shock to Sinn Féin, if they were being honest. And I think the question that you asked demonstrates that. I'll give you an example. The Sinn Féin candidate in my constituency that headed the poll with 8,000 some hundred votes was completely unknown throughout the constituency. She had contested the local elections in May, and to get elected to the local authority, it takes about, well, on first preference votes, you'd need to have about 1,100 votes. She got 380 votes in May, failing to even make any impression on a local authority election. She got 8,000 some hundred votes. So people were voting for the brand, and that maybe is the next question where we pivot to. It was voting for the brand rather than the candidate, which is very familiar to many of you across Europe, where people will vote for a party. In Ireland it's a bit different because of the electoral system and how people vote. A lot of it is based on the personality and the local dynamics. There's a candidate in another constituency who, just in order to have a presence on the ticket, they ran this individual who had a family holiday booked in Lanzarote or Tenerife, and so for a 3-week campaign was 2 weeks on holidays, and she came back with a number of days to go, and now she's a member of Parliament. So that will tell you. Now it's somewhat funny, and but it speaks to something. It speaks to where the surge was coming from and why that surge was there and why it was based on the image or the brand. My party used to be accused of being, outdated because and our voters were seeing as outdated because it used to be said that if you put the emblem of Fianna Fáil on the back of a monkey, the monkey would get elected to Parliament. So that was a sort of a casting an aspersion on our voters that they would elect an animal just because they said they were Fianna Fáil. Here's an example of where candidates unknown to their electorate, unknown to their region, unknown to their people, were elected on a national brand. And that probably speaks to, trying to understand how this happened, where it's coming from, what's the mood of the Irish people at this particular time. And if we could maybe speak to that, if that's okay. I think it's clear there were two very major issues that the electorate were exercised about, and it was principally housing and health. We've had an issue around housing and homelessness, and a failure to, and rising rents, and a failure to address that from a political perspective. In the 2016 election, there were a number suggested that there was about 5,500 or 6,000 people who were defined as being without a home. In other words, they were either staying with family or friends, or they were accommodated in emergency accommodation in hotels by their local authorities or family hubs. It's not an unusual concept across Europe, but it was something we hadn't been used to. And it manifested itself from the property-related crash that we'd had from 2011 onwards, where there was a downturn in the building sector, new homes weren't being built, there was nowhere for people to rent. People had lost their homes through failure to keep maintaining their mortgages, and they had to be accommodated and housed by the state. The state hadn't responded by building enough social houses. So that crisis has increased from 6,000 to 10,000 people nationally over the period of time. And people got very exercised about that, not just the people who found themselves in emergency accommodation, but people felt that, and rightly so, felt that this was a blight on all, it was a blight on society, and that the state or the government hadn't responded. Now, there was a lot of policy measures taken that didn't meet that demand or didn't resolve that issue. We also had issues around our health service. People waiting on trolleys in accident and emergency rooms where they didn't get processed because there wasn't enough bed capacity. The state didn't move quick enough to appoint more doctors and nurses and provide more bed accommodation for a growing population. And much of this is as a result of the financial crash and the length of time trying to get the economy back on track again and having the appropriate funds available to do that. So I think a lot of people felt economic activity has recovered, employment has increased, we're back to full employment, the state coffers is reasonably healthy. Why aren't these problems being resolved? These are problems that you could understand during a financial crash. We're now 5-6 years through the financial crash. We don't feel that the benefits of the recovery have trickled down to the lives of people. Cost of living has increased, insurance costs have increased. So even people back at work, they just don't feel it in their pockets that they're better off. They're working hard and they're still in economic squeeze. And I suppose some of that is because we're still carrying the burden of debt associated with the financial crash, and that is putting a significant strain. So next government is going to have a really big challenge now to find the monies to address these issues in a manner that the public have demanded, and being able to do everything else that you have to do as a society and as an economy as well, and limit yourself to your borrowing potential or the ability of the state to borrow.
But before speaking of the government, I would like to get back on the campaign actually. What was Fianna Fáil against the background problems concerning healthcare, the housing sector? What was your party suggesting? Yeah. Your campaign motto was an island for all. Yeah. How did you plan to create this island for all? Okay, so it was very similar to our campaign in 2016. And our campaign in 2016 probably resonated better, because people were just coming through the crash. And we made it very clear that we weren't about introducing tax cuts that gave money back to the better off in society.
we felt that it was better to retain the tax level and invested in social housing projects, invested in health, invested in education, in public services generally. And that resonated really well with the public, which saw us get a very significant bounce from 21 seats in 2011 to 44 seats in 2016. And we continued that campaign message. But the difficulty we had was that during the course of 2016 to 2020, we had facilitated Fine Gael to be in government. We didn't go into coalition with them, but we had a confidence and supply arrangement, which basically facilitated Fine Gael having a minority government. They had all the ministers with an association with a number of independents. But I think we were punished by the electorate for allowing that government to continue to fail to deliver on those big issues. So on the doors, when I and my colleagues sought to explain to people that, you know, we would do things differently, the attitude was, well, why did you leave them there so long? You could have brought that government down because it was a minority government. And we probably went a year longer than we should in that confidence and supply, but we did so because we wanted the country to have a stable government during the Brexit negotiations. You know, our confidence and supply was for 3 years, so around this time last year, that came to a conclusion, and we entered into a further year grace period, if you want. We did so because we thought, we believed, and we still do, it was the right thing to do for our country. Politically, for our party, it has caused a difficulty for us. But sometimes in politics, well, always in politics, you should do what you think is right for your country, rather than just what's right for your party. So Sinn Féin will have some lessons to learn along there, and we've seen how they managed their business in the 6 counties over a protracted period of time. So that might reflect, to some extent, it wasn't the message, it wasn't our message of what we might do, it was a punishment for our continuing to support or facilitate the existence of Fine Gael in government, and an inability of us to differentiate ourselves as being different from them.
Thank you very much. I might also add that the system of confidence and supply is between 2 parties that are still, that have kind of the same roots, is quite uncommon. We wouldn't find it in any other European country. And you could also read, like in media review, that the duopoly between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil has been broken by a new party that has appeared on a political stage. So Ireland is really confronted with a new situation. And in the beginning, you gave an insight into the results. I might resume them quickly. So we have Fianna Fáil with 38 seats, then Sinn Féin 37. If you do the maths, you will see that they don't have a majority of 80 seats. So a third party is needed to form a government. Could you give us some insights into the position of Fianna Fáil for government negotiations in the next weeks? Which options are there? Which options are being discussed or excluded even before the elections?
Well, I've always been conscious of defeated candidates and their views. So I want to be careful about anything that I might say, because I think, not being a member of Parliament now, I don't want to put pressure on those that are elected. But I'll reflect a little bit maybe on the landscape rather than giving what I think should happen. Both main parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have indicated throughout the campaign that they would not coalesce, that they would not enter government with Sinn Féin. Now, that may have helped Sinn Féin, because the people who were unhappy with the success or failure of the last administration may have felt that's a bit of an arrogant position to take, and it may have helped to promote Sinn Féin. It's them against us. We're the outsiders. We've got the answers. Now, let's be under no illusion. Sinn Féin's manifesto and their campaign strategy was populist in the extreme. To use that term, the fiscal space, or the available monies to the state to spend discretionally over the next 5 years, based on current budgetary projections, is about 11 billion. Now, Sinn Féin would indicate, in terms of their promises, to spend 20 odd billion in that period of time. So, it's almost Trump-esque about building houses. We will build 100,000 houses in this period of time. Well, that's fine, and the line being, we'll build it on public lands. But a lot of public-owned land is not in the space where the houses are needed or demanded. So, in order to do that, do you have to sequester land? Do you have to compulsorily purchase it? The action required behind some of the promises are extreme. And I'm not so sure at this juncture that it's possible to do that. Now, of course, if you take on some very draconian powers, maybe it is possible to do it, and maybe that's what's required. I don't know. But to try to get that done in a relatively short period of time, I mean, we had people on the doorstep saying that, you get 20,000 houses built in the first 100 days. I mean, some crazy, promises being made by individual candidates, just to get stuff through and go through procurement and all the things that are part of the rule of law, and the body of administration is going to take time. But I think the public clearly want action, and what will now be required is of Sinn Féin to do that. What that makeup is, I don't know. Looking at the numbers, and even if I did have a say within my own party, I don't see an obvious route here that's acceptable to the public, that would put a coherent programme for government together. I think all parties should talk, at least, and I think Sinn Féin should be included in the talks between the different parties. But I'm not so sure that either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael would be able to reach a position of compromise based on the divergence that exists in the policies that are there, and their various taxation policies. Because Sinn Féin will talk about increasing taxes very considerably in certain areas, and there's always somebody out there, and it's not the individual. There's always some tax pot of money that can be sequestered. Difficulty with that, of course, is that if you tax any of the corporate streams, if you want, there's a potential knock-on effect on job creation and investment back into the economy, and oftentimes that's not factored into the campaign rhetoric. But I think the next number of weeks and months will be rather interesting in trying to see how that formulation comes together.
Indeed, thank you very much for that outlook. So options for government are all but clear, as you might have understood. I would like to open now our discussion for a question round. I would simply ask you to present yourself briefly, to ask one concise question if possible, because time is limited. And yes, I would suggest to Jana to speak up.
And then you just summarize the question quickly after.
Okay, great. We'll do it that way. So, Mr. in the back.
So if there is, for example, young people, they vote in one person part, and also rural area versus urban area. And the second question would be if the Brexit entered the debate, you think it was not influencing the vote.
Okay, thank you.
I will briefly summarize, also for those who follow us on the live stream. So we actually had two questions. The first question's on the different voter groups. If you could see some patterns, for example, between rural areas and urban areas, between young and older voters. And second question was if Brexit entered the campaign discussions before the elections, yes or no?
Yeah, so again, I haven't had a chance to kind of analyse in any great detail the stats, but from recollection, I think Sinn Féin was ahead in all demographics except over 55 or 65, or over 65. So in all the demographics except the over 65s, and I mean that's probably in line with older profile of people over 65s who trace Sinn Féin's history and have a knowledge of Sinn Féin's role in the 6 counties and its origins there back to the early 70s and its connections with the IRA. Younger cohort wouldn't have that corporate memory and don't seem to be concerned by it, which is fair enough. On the other side, in terms of issues that were of relevance to the voters, the public service broadcaster, together with one of our leading newspapers, did an exit poll, which was reasonably accurate, but in terms of how people voted, 3 parties were within a point or 2 of each other. They were all 22, 22.3, 22.4, 22.5, or 22.3, whatever. And it, you had that 1.9% spread, and that came into play. Sinn Féin were a little bit ahead, Fine Gael were a little bit less. We were about the same. But they also asked what the issues were in people's interest. And I don't have it to hand, but I know that health was 36 or 7, and housing was 32 or 4. And Brexit, which is what Fine Gael campaigned on, Fine Gael outgoing government campaigned heavily on, you need to hold on to us because we are the people who have negotiated Brexit to date, and we're the best party to do the trade negotiations that will now take place. 1% of the people who voted saw Brexit as a defining issue. So even the hardcore Fine Gael base didn't even believe that Brexit was an issue in terms of the next phase. It sort of brings me back to a point that we often forget in politics when you're around it for a while. Eaten bread is often soon forgotten, or is always forgotten. So if you think that you, on the basis of what you have done, that it's a good platform to get re-elected, I think those statistics would certainly tell you that that's not something that you really need to spend any time mulling over in planning your next election strategy. It's all about what you're going to do next and how you're going to do it. Of course, if you've failed in the past, it'll be remembered all right.
Thank you for that advice. The next question, I saw one hand. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Alessandro Gallo, and I'm an individual member of the ALDE party. Staying on this topic, I want to ask how much internal affairs and external affairs played a role in the electoral campaign. Mainly if the overseas Irish, the Irish that emigrated in the past that are still culturally Irish, played a role in the electoral debate. And also, according to you, what is the lesson learned by this election? What is something, whether there is something to change for the next term?
Okay, do you want to?
Yeah, quick sum up. So first question, the balance between internal and external affairs, so by the Irish being abroad, if I got you correctly. And the second question, forgot that one. Lessons learned for the next elections. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so in our country, we don't, the expats don't vote, but maybe I can reflect a little bit around that. We still have a large cohort of our young people who left during the financial crash, and they're in places like Australia, New Zealand, principally, some of the UK and some of the US. And that was reflected on the doors, particularly in the rural areas where elderly parents were bemoaning the fact that their younger people from the communities had left and wouldn't return. And I think that played into a sense of isolation, a sense of loss, and therefore a desire for change. Because what I should have said earlier, a very strong narrative that developed throughout the campaign was the need for change. So the word change was used a lot. No, we've seen that used elsewhere as well. A need for change, and that was pushed by Sinn Féin. So from that point of view, not so much in terms of people's voting from outside the country, but their loss to the country and their connections with their parents and their friends did have an influence, because many would like to come home but didn't see the opportunities. Now, there are a lot of opportunities now, if you want, in terms of the demand for building workers to come back. Lessons learned on the campaign, I think it's around action. It's around getting things done, not allowing the normal bureaucracy to delay the delivery of key projects. This government, and maybe the previous one, had gotten bogged down in bureaucracy. There was a plan to roll out broadband throughout the country. It was promised back in 2012, and they only signed the contract a couple of weeks before the election. People didn't believe it anymore. And they went through very rigorous, like I accept we have procurement rules that are largely agreed across the European Union, but other countries seem to be better at getting it done and not allowing this prolonged process around delivery. Now, sometimes it suits a country to have that bureaucracy dwindle along the background, because it means you don't have to have the money up front. You can talk about it, it's happening, but it's not getting delivered. When it came to hospitals and housing, people weren't prepared to accept those kind of delays. They wanted action. They didn't need, pictures of ministers launching something, with the high visible vest and a hard hat. And we had loads of that stuff around, the building projects. What they wanted to see was doors being opened and lights being turned on in units. Now, we did that back in the 60s, and there were some social issues around developing large-scale social housing projects that became ghettos in certain areas, and there's a lot of regeneration going on in Dublin to address that. So there's need for caution and care around some of the social housing projects, but reality was houses were not built, accommodation units were not being developed at the rate that were needed, and some of our housing stock was in the wrong location. It's not where people wanted to live, in the more rural and isolated areas. And then there's a need to spread the economic activity outside of the capital. And that's a challenge for a lot of countries across Europe because of the urbanisation of societies generally.
Some more questions? Yes.
Susan Hartig, Anchor 21 Consultancy. Timmy, I see that the Green Party was quite successful. And given EU Green Deal and similar initiatives, how do you assess the potential of this Green Party for the future?
Yeah, thanks very much. I suppose that was going to be the big story of the election, following on from the local elections, because we had seen the Greens get a very good vote at the locals and the European election. So all the main parties were focusing on greening their manifestos. There was a lot of greenwashing going on, and that was the expected story. That was the expected story from this election. Now, the Greens have had a fantastic election going from 2 to 12, but it's being that has been lost completely in public discourse since, because of the major shift in support for Sinn Féin. Like, I think all parties were gearing up to address the climate change issue. There was consensus. I sat on a committee that brought forward a plan to implement cross-party support. We had managed to battle the introduction, or to support the introduction of a carbon tax in a progressive way that would escalate along a trajectory between now and 2030. Actually, Sinn Féin opposed that. Talked a lot about what needed to happen, but magicked up the result without actually saying how you do it. Tax the polluters. This is the smaller parties. The smaller parties of the hard left believe that the solution to reducing carbon emissions is to put a very significant tax on the 10 biggest corporations that are responsible for carbon emissions. Now, it's no surprise that 11 of the 10 are oil companies based outside the state. So how you tax those companies is beyond me, because the only way you can do it is to do it on the demand side and try to encourage people over time by showing that the cost is going to increase if you continue to drive a petrol or a diesel car if you don't need to. So that's where the real issue is now going to be, whatever administration comes into place. If you're against a carbon tax, how do you manage to control the emissions of carbon, and where do you find the monies to address the requirement to assist people in retrofitting their homes to reduce their demand for carbon emissions. So there's quite a bit to go there.
Gentleman, the first row.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Thomas. I work at the European Commission. I have two short questions. You don't have to go into all the details, but even though I tried to read the Wikipedia on the single transferable vote, I still haven't understood, is all the vote determined in the constituency?
Yes.
So could a party that only gains 4% nationwide, but is never stronger than that in any constituency, not be elected at all? And how does this transfer work? Because you form some kind of alliances, I read somewhere.
Yes.
And
so
the second question is, what could all of this result mean for the future Brexit negotiations?
So just a short summary. Again, a question on the quite atypical voting system in Ireland. So how it all works and the future of the Brexit negotiations.
Yeah. So the answer to your first question is, so you can have a party of just one member. So you register as a political party. You can be very strong in your constituency, and there is one. It's a party called Aontú, which was a breakaway party from Sinn Féin, broke away on a social issue of abortion, and ran candidates all around the country. I can't remember the number of constituencies. Only elected one member of parliament, so very strong in his own constituency, and I think maybe had 1% of the vote, 1 or 2% of the vote, because of running candidates in various constituencies, but only got one elected. So there's no capacity for that percentage to have any impact. So the vote that's taken only reflects on the candidate and the individual in the constituency concerned. So it's an absolute single vote. There's no number of seats assigned at a later stage based on your percentage, which happens in companies. So the vote is direct for the individual, and the commentary afterwards is really only commentary in terms of what the percentage is and means across. It doesn't have any electoral benefit to you. So that might answer the first part of your question. On the what's the impact for Brexit negotiations? Look, I think that the outgoing government did a good job in terms of its discussions and negotiations around the Brexit deal up to that point. But it was effectively led by Michel Barnier. It was led by the Commission and the Union generally, and for sure Ireland did, through its negotiating team, or its membership and its Foreign Minister and European Affairs Minister Taoiseach, put forward in a very strong and coherent way the Irish agenda. I think any administration that comes in will put forward the Irish agenda. The real negotiations, as you know, will be around what the Commission and the Council ultimately agree, and I wouldn't be concerned from that perspective, and clearly the Irish public weren't concerned from that perspective either, as the outgoing poll demonstrated.
Yes, please.
Dennis J. Buckley, Irish and Europe Association. First point of contention is that Irish immigrants do not have a vote in the elections. And that is part, from the Liberal point of view, this is part of the European Union deficit, because we have a situation where we have 250,000 Irish citizens living in EU or EA countries, and they have no input into the government that jointly decides decisions with the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. So we're left helpless as part of this European project and on the side. And we didn't see any clear reference in any of the manifestos about giving Irish immigrants a vote. We're not saying Irish citizens, we're saying Irish citizens who lived and worked in the European Union. And we have a situation, we've seen how in Eastern Europe, how their immigrants actually enhanced democracy and values in countries when their vote was needed. I would take the view that Irish immigrants living abroad were taking a wise decision, looked very wisely as future stakeholders for those who are going back. But we have a double standard in Ireland. You all want the Irish immigrants back, but you don't want to be the stakeholders in the future. And this is an issue is addressed. I just want to make this point because it's very important. We oppose the last government's view of having a referendum giving Irish citizens a vote for the president. They had to change the constitution to do that because the constitution states that Irish citizens can have a vote, but it's subject to legislation, and the legislation can provide Irish immigrants a vote without a referendum. Now, getting back to Brexit, I'm concerned what's going to happen. We know if there's a Sinn Féin-led government, we know that the future trade agreement does not require most likely approval of the national parliaments. It's going to be at governmental level. And we know there's going to be a lot of horse trading done in the European Union from June onwards. My concern is what capacities have we, as a Sinn Féin-led government, based on their record on foreign policy and their approach to the European Union, what credibility will they have, even though we have a very good permanent civil service doing their job, but their hands are going to be decided by actions of a party that is contrary to the views of what is good for Europe. The other point I want to make is what impact will their foreign policy views on many issues impacting foreign investment in Ireland and their taxation on executives that are highly paid executives that attract foreign investment. How long will that take to have an impact on the Irish economy?
Thank you very much for your insights. So a short wrap up for those following us online. There was a remark from the audience, an Irish citizen living abroad in Brussels, I assume, with the information that Irish citizens, Irish immigrants are not entitled to vote, and a question on how these discrepancy is going to be resolved. And you also expressed your worries over a Sinn Féin-led government and the credibility when it comes to Brexit negotiations and European affairs.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dennis. I appreciate your request. On the overseas voting, look, I've looked at issues in other countries, and I kind of like the French model, in where they have a senator that's elected by the diaspora, whilst some people engage very fully with it. The overall impact is usually negligible in terms of participation. A lot of people who travel don't really participate, and because of the way our system works, they assign themselves to the constituency where they came from. So there's work to be done, but I certainly believe that Irish citizens who are abroad and want an extension of the franchise, that has to be progressed over time, and that's why I think the first phase of that is the participation in the presidential elections, because there's only one constituency for that, and I think over time you're going to see movement there. Your next question around the impact of Sinn Féin on Brexit, I have to accept the outcome of the election. The people have spoken, and as a Democrat I respect that, and the campaign is over for now, so there's no point trying to refight that, and I go back to the point in terms of, from the public perspective, based on the exit poll, they weren't concerned about it. You and I might believe that they should have been more concerned about it, but in politics you get what you vote for, so we're going to have to see how that plays out. And look, I don't want to hammer up on Sinn Féin either. There's some really smart people there, who have the interests of the country at heart. They have a different outlook, a different ideology to I and others. There are some people who don't have any history in politics and don't have the experience and have been elected on the brand. But so there's some sensible people there. Whether or not they can form a government is another day's work. The other question, the third part of your question, how long will it take this inconclusive election result to impact on foreign investment and taxation and the proposed Sinn Féin taxation model and foreign investment? Well, the answer is it won't take long at all. It has already started. There was a very considerable, I think, 10%, but just don't hold me to this. I did hear some numbers yesterday and Monday of a drop in the Irish stock exchange, a write-off of was it maybe, what was it? 1.5 billion. And I think that represented, in some stocks anyway, 8 to 10%. Maybe on the financial stocks, because there was concern in some of our banks that there may be an effort by Sinn Féin to limit to some extent interest rates on the pillar banks that are partially owned by the state. So there's been some very considerable fluctuation in the trading performance of those stocks. I'm aware also through some media commentary around investment funds moving money in the aftermath of the results. So the answer is not long at all. Whether that will impact on other decisions taken elsewhere around the continuation of plans that were already in place, that remains to be seen. I've no doubt that there will be a considerable period of uncertainty until such time as a government is formed. Clearly Sinn Féin are not going to be a single party government, so whatever radical elements might be in their manifesto that would frighten capital in the intervening period, it's clear that whatever programme for government, if there's going to be a programme for government, there will have to be compromise right across the piece. And that's always a defence of radical parties who want to be in government. You can, I think it was Mario Cuomo, a former governor of the state of New York, since deceased, but I think his son is still there, Andrew Cuomo, but the older one, Mario Cuomo, said that in politics, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. So to some extent, there's the hard left parties often, if they have a desire to be in government, the promises will have to be moderated. So some of the very hardline approach, it might suit them to be neutered to some extent in some kind of a future coalition.
Thank you very much. Looking at the time, I would say that we still have some time for a very last question, a brief question, please, and one question instead of to the lady here. Yes.
Oh, well, it's on a very light-hearted note. I have a document here that says today is Timmy Dooley's birthday.
Yes. Happy birthday.
You're right about that.
Thank you very much.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Timmy. Happy birthday to you.
I'm sorry we can't see you live.
So I would say this is a very good wrap-up. This is the best last question I ever had. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just to thank ALDE and the Foundation for your interest in affairs in Ireland. We've gone through a difficult few days. It's been a difficult campaign. But like all political parties, we're absolutely committed to the future of our country, to the future of the European Union, to working closely with you, to having your assistance in developing our policies and developing as a nation. We've come through a difficult time. We have real challenges ahead, and the uncertainty of the result adds to that. But you know, I could take a very negative view from the loss of seats in our party and to our position, and say to my own loss. But like most people who are around politics, there are good days and bad days. But people are always sovereign. We're fortunate that we live in a part of the world where democracy prevails, and you mightn't like the outcome of it, but the rule of law is respected and must be respected. And we have some concerns about other parts of the Union, about the influence of certain strong populist leaders that have succeeded in moving away or starting to deviate from the ideals and principles of our Union. I don't see that happening in Ireland. I hope it doesn't happen, and I hope this wave of what can be defined as populism is measured and controlled, and over time will abate. And a lot of that will depend on the capacity of the incoming administration to respond to the needs. And I think that's where and I reflected a little bit on it earlier, how the over bureaucracy, if you want, in some state delivery models has the capacity to stir up that populism, because action doesn't happen in the way or in the time that people want. So there's a lot of positives that we must take too from our democracy, and not reflect too negatively on it. So thanks again for the opportunity to have a discussion with you.
Thank you again, Timmy Dooley, for making the way all here to Brussels on your birthday in the name of ALDE Party and Friedrich Naumann Foundation. To all those having joined us here at the ALDE Party headquarters, thank you for coming here. Please feel free, now that we've wrapped up this liberal breakfast, to still grab a coffee, a croissant, to start the day freshly. To those having followed us online, thank you very much and see you soon. Have a nice day.